Ah, welcome, viewers. I find myself here in the north, forsaking my usual Scotch for a bit of a warm nog on a chill evening in Canada. But here we are once again to carry on with our lovely narrative and diatribe of the end times. And with me, of course, as usual, are the philosophers, Josh and Vince. Say hello to the folks, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Hello, folks.
So we now will pick up our story of Nagash, the End Times, with Chapter 3. So just to bring us quickly up to speed with what's occurred in the prior chapter, is it finally came to the great culmination after several forces of the old world became aware of something troublesome occurring in Sylvania. They all converged upon Sylvania, but it was only the High Elves that actually reached and witnessed the final ritual of Arkan the Black and Manfred reviving Nagash himself. But let's also remember that at the tail end of that, it was revealed to us that the summoning of Nagash was not entirely 100% successful, partially because of the mild deception, I would suppose you'd call it, of the Everchild not being of pure royal elf blood. So therefore Nagash was left without the ability to ensnare the wind of death in its entirety, and leaving him a little bit incomplete. So now we will move along to Chapter 3 and introduce another of Nagash's minions. And I think I'll pass to Vince to introduce this one and take us through the opening salvo of this chapter.
Well, thank you very much. Yes. We'll start with this little thing here. It happens to be from the back. And what does it say right up top? It says, "The world is ending, though few believe it." Yes, indeed. Now we get to the real meat of it, where the world starts to really collapse. And this chapter opens up with Neferata, first amongst the vampires, a very ancient member of her kind, who had unlocked the secrets of eternal life from the books of Nagash. And she lives way up in, a sort of icy cold vampire mountaintop. And she is famous for being a plotter and a schemer. And she is sort of sitting back, observing all these movements in the world, piecing together what's going on. And she realizes, as few do at this point still, that Nagash is going to rise. And she, seeing that this will happen, figuring that it is unavoidable at this point, knows that when he returns, he will be seeking for his Mortarks, for his servants. And she wants to make sure that she is in a strong position, already pre-plotting, to place herself in a position of power. Boy, is that a lot of P words. At the foot of Nagash.
Yeah. So I think it's worth a note, so the viewers can follow along, that this chapter picks up, in fact, several months before the ritual that occurred at the tail end of Chapter 2. So
yeah, that's an excellent point. No, absolutely. No, thank you. Yes, that is an excellent point. Yes, there's a lot of back jump switching as these chapters change as far as the time goes, and even as the books go. And that's something we'll repeatedly see, is that you go to a point and then come back and see it from another perspective. And so that's what's happening here. And so Neferata basically decides that upon seeing Arkan and Manfred march out, that it's time for her to sort of, do her thing. And there's one sort of event that pushes her over the edge, the straw that broke the camel's back, and that's basically when a horde of demons attacks the Silver Pinnacle, her icy vampire throne mountain. And it sort of makes her realize that if the forces of chaos are striking out this strongly, that, okay, it's time to move, time to go make sure we're on the side of Nagash and place herself powerfully there. So after the sort of demons are repelled and disappear, she sets off. And she has a very specific plan. Neferata spent, being as ancient as she is, she's several millennia old, she, at some point in her wanderings several thousands of years back, had discovered these ancient secret dwarf halls forged in, time immemorial by the greatest of dwarven lords and heroes and effectively gods. And these ancient halls held some power, and she wasn't even sure exactly what it is, though she had a good idea. And she wants to get a hold of it, take that power, and present it to Nagash, figuring that this will, not only this serves her purpose in two ways. First, she'll get right to Nagash, because this passageway will effectively let her sidestep all sorts of enemy forces and with her whole army. And two, it'll let her grab this power on the way, as though she's sort of stopping by a McDonald's on the way to there and just picking up like a Happy Meal of dwarven ancient runic power. And
what a lovely way to put that.
Yeah, it's like a gyrocopter toy in every Happy Meal too, so that's nice. And the other important thing that happens here right at the beginning is another character sort of introduced to us. The Neferata, sort of within her own court, just as she is a schemer, she keeps this court of female vampires, this big coven of a bunch of handmaidens who constantly jockey and position themselves for her favor, just as she is planning to do with Nagash. And chief amongst her handmaidens, the only one she almost trusts, I don't think she ever really trusts anyone, is this handmaiden Ementet. And Ementet is sort of like her spy and her ears within the coven, and sort of helps her to head off plots, because obviously some of the vampiresses that she has taught would just as soon displace her as gain her favor. And so,
I kind of think of these two, if I can interject for just a second. I kind of think of them as like the Paris Hilton and what's the other lady? Nicole
Nicole Richie.
Yeah, Nicole Richie. That they're each other's BFFs, and they plot and scheme and giggle behind everybody else, and they're their own little inner circle within another circle of friends.
Just for the record, Kieran, you have now completely ruined my image of Neferata forever.
I already hated Neferata, as she's the enemy of my particular favorite special character in the world, which we'll get to in a later chapter. But that I have absolutely no problem with the comparison of her to Paris Hilton. I think that Neferata is just as much of a trash, awful, worthless waste as the real Paris Hilton is. So that seems fair to me.
I'm just hoping and praying we'll never see the release of that tape. That's all I'm hoping for.
Well, when you do that Mortarth model of Neferata, and you find like maybe a little extra little Chihuahua model you can put on her on her lap there with it, that'll bring it all together.
Ugh.
You're right, then.
Ugh.
There we go. She can float around. There she is.
Oh, there she is.
Yes, there's Neferata. So that's who we're talking about on her little cloud. So Neferata and Ementet and the whole host, basically, Neferata sort of like empties the vaults, basically, right? She's like, all right, get everybody up. We're moving. This is we're on the march. So she gathers everybody up. They shout out, "We'll ride," and down they go. And they cut this sort of circuitous path, trying to like basically avoid dwarves and goblins and everybody. They're trying to like take these trying to very much ride the line in between everything. She, for the most part, is very successful for quite a big part of her journey. She makes her way down. She manages, she gets in battles with small goblin forces here or there and scatters all of them with ease. She herself is a master necromancer. All her coven is master necromancers, and they have a big undead throng, and these are basically dumb goblins who occasionally have wolf riders. And so she keeps breaking them and scattering them and scattering them, but what she sort of doesn't realize she's doing is making a bigger problem for herself. Because all of these goblins that get broken flee and end up in tunnels, and eventually all kind of funnel down into this one place, into this Skull Chasm. And there in Skull Chasm, because it's sort of the natural path through the mountains, is where all these broken remnants and hordes then come together and find themselves then called upon by a very cagey and smart goblin. As Neferata marches into the past, then these two have their are going to have a confrontation.
Yeah, so after chasing all these little goblin tribes ahead of her, it does eventually in the storyline, it comes to a head where it has to eventually erupt into a conflict. But maybe we'll pass to Josh to tell us how the scheming goblins, after being chased along the mountain paths for quite a stretch of time, finally find a little bit of backbone.
Absolutely. Well, interestingly enough, particularly given that Neferata is coming basically on a favor-currying mission, we find a night goblin war boss by the name of Grolsik, who is also on a favor-currying mission. He is leading his tribe south to join up with Skarsnik, the great warlord of the night goblins, and basically catches the side of Neferata, and his group is driven down like all the others. But he's smart enough to realize how many greenskins have been driven south by the undead hordes. So what he does is takes his sort of truest, most faithful goblins and goes, as the book says, recruiting. And he goes around and gathers the Moonclaw shamans to himself, who have found a great deal of very potent mushrooms on their quest, and then the Moonhallas, the Blood Peaks, just quite a number of other goblin tribes that he pulls together with the ultimate aim of being victorious here and essentially having a big victory to carry to Skarsnik so that he can join the Wa that Skarsnik is starting. And it's actually pretty interesting because he shows a pretty significant understanding of tactics as he set his plan. He understands the land much better than Neferata does, and understands that by her going into Skull Chasm, she's walking into the perfect natural point for an ambush. So what he does is he assembles some of his troops essentially to kind of lead her on into the chasm, and then has others hide in the caverns that line the chasm, with the ultimate idea of sort of the rope-a-dope strategy. He's going to pull Neferata in, get her forces committed, and then close the trap. And I find it interesting here, and I see a lot of parallels how Neferata is written here to how Manfred is written early on. Represented as this very arrogant, very full of themselves character who allows their own arrogance to blind them. And
you're right, it does seem like a standard vampire trait, doesn't it?
It does, and I think I find it interesting that almost instantly after we see in the book Manfred being brought to heel and sort of controlled by Nagash, we get this other character who, other than a gender swap, could be a carbon copy of him in terms of sort of motivations and reactions to events.
Yeah. Aside from the difference, and maybe let's talk about this for a second. Aside from the difference that even before she sets out from Silverspear, she has the recognition that Nagash is the Almighty, and I need to do something to curry his favor and raise my peg on the ladder. Not because I'm better than Nagash, but because I need to be better than the other guys at least. That's where she differs a little bit to Manfred, I think.
Right, but I ultimately think that she's conniving enough where if she saw a weakness in Nagash, she would take advantage of it like Manfred would. I think the main difference is if you look at her history, she is the only one of these characters who has sort of failed Nagash in the past and has been on the receiving end of his wrath. So I think she has more fear to her than Manfred does. But I could see them both taking advantage of those weaknesses if Nagash presented any.
Right. So she doesn't want to get another spanking, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
Pretty
she's gotten
much.
the belt before, and she knows better this now, a little bit.
Right. Well,
But to kind of go in, I just think it's very interesting how they set her apart as she's definitely not a warrior type. Both in here, it talks about early on that other more wary commanders would have seen what the goblins were doing and would have been aware of it. And she just continues pushing on because she's not that combat character. She is a manipulator of the shadows. She's not used to combat. And because of that, things start going badly for her very rapidly. When Grulsik trips his trap on her and they start driving out squigs from the mountainside and the pillars are coming in, her units collapse pretty casually. The greenskins start off doing very, very well. And it's not until Neferata herself finally realizes that the only way that we're going to win this is if I get involved. And the best part about it is how angry that she is about having to get involved.
that was remarkable.
I want to read something because it's just the way it's done is amazing. It says, in her rage, she was shorn of her beautiful facade. Her face contorted in anger, and her eyes were blazing red. The sheer indignity was the worst of it, for she was not some lackey or self-made commoner raised to prominence. She was royalty, the firstborn of her kind. Others, she thought, might readily wade into the front to lend aid to the fighting. She ought to be above such things. She was not Krell or some lowly von Karstein. But her army was being dismantled before her eyes. It seemed there was left no other choice. With a hiss, she urged her mount forward. And it's so funny because it's really that anger that starts eroding the advantage that the greenskins have. It's not that she's just murdering them. It's that she's so angry at having to get her hands dirty that her rage is doing enough to start eroding the morale of the night goblins, and they start falling apart and retreating from her. And again, things start kind of twisting away until the coming of the Chimera. It tells us early on that this chasm is filled with monsters and other creatures, and the goblins have been so far pretty good at avoiding them. But during the battle, the Chimera comes out, and there's a great battle scene between the Chimera and Neferata, and it goes kind of back and forth. And it's looking kind of not great for Neferata. She's taken some big hits against this thing. And then...
Well, before you reveal that, because I know where you're going with it, just
okay.
I want to slip in. I wanted to say something about this segment of the chapter that
Okay.
I think is really fantastically written, and that is it does go through some description about how the goblin battle line is drawn up, and how it sort of turns the tides against the undead, and it does a wonderful description of sort of laying out how the stupid trolls are said to block the escape from Skull Chasm. So it's the dumb trolls that can regenerate and take a lot of punishment that are at the end of it. And then out of all these tunnels from the sides, they herd out squigs and squig hoppers and mangler squigs, and they just run amok and mayhem at the flanks of the undead. But aside from to say that, I think it's really reflective of how you would expect from players of Warhammer to see an orc and goblin battle line laid out and play out. I think they did a pretty good rapport of that here. And I just wanted to slip that in before we move on to the finales of this battle.
As usual, the other player fighting the undead seems to be fighting with one arm tied behind their back, as once again they forgot to bring wizards to the fight against the undead, who all marvel at the necromancer's continued ability to raise undead.
Yeah. Well, in the defense of that, they do mention it, although I find it interesting. They mention it in the army write-up, but they don't really give a lot of page time to it. But they do talk about they have a shaman called Brack Batwing. Yeah. And it specifically in his little blurb early on, it talks about how his particularly powerful mushrooms help during the early part of the battle, but then during the second half of the battle, his stomach cramps from the fungus and his natural cowardice get in the way. And so that's really the only place it mentions it, but you can kind of, knowing that, you can kind of see, like, yeah, things went so good because the shaman is able to keep the magic under control, but then pretty much once Neferata enters the battle, you're pretty much assuming that's when the stomach cramps started.
Yeah, probably. Just taking in too much juice.
Right.
Okay. So now pick it up again where Neferata is having her little struggle with the Chimera.
Right. So basically bats come down, and all of a sudden when the bat's clear enough to see, there's Krell. He and his forces have stumbled upon it. It specifically says, Neferata says she's not certain whether Krell has come to aid her or to execute her at Nagash's behalf. But he does come and free her from the Chimera. He kills it, though not quite fast enough to prevent it from giving what seems to be a mortal wound with its tail to Neferata. I specifically think it mentions that it opens her from ribcage to hip bone. And
yeah, she just gets skewered, really, is how I read it. She gets spiked right through the midriff and out the back end.
Mm-hmm. But then, basically, as she is vulnerable and not certain whether Krell is going to take her out in this moment of vulnerability, we find out that the ritual in Sylvania gets completed and Nagash is reborn. And the power of Nagash being reborn just fills the undead with vigor. It specifically says that in one instant, Neferata went from being near the end of her millennia-long existence to watching herself heal completely. And pretty much with that added power, that pretty much spells the end for poor Grolsik and his tribe. As they had beaten down pretty much with End of Death whips through at Nagash's command, all of the undead resummon, and it says in the space of a few heartbeats, the tables had turned, and it was Grolkis who now stood surrounded. And needless to say, the poor goblins do not have a good rest of the day, as it is pretty much ended there. And Neferata knows that he's back. She's felt his power, and she knows that her game has now begun. Because the way she sees it, the Mortalks are going to be striving for power and position in Nagash's eyes, and this is where she rules. This is her arena. Obviously, war is not it, as we've seen through the rest of this battle, but she actually seems pretty happy for where things are right now. She has Krell to a point where she thinks he will be serving her, and she sets Imemtet, her handmaiden, to kind of keep an eye on Krell and to act as her spy amongst Krell's forces. But for the most part, despite how the sort of beating her force took here, Neferata's in a good place. She's ready to play the game and now has a significant stake in it at this point.
I think
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Vince, make your point. I'll fill in later.
That's fine. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the subtitle of this portion of the chapter should just be called, "But Then." Because, it does this thing in writing that, honestly, there's portions of this that just kill me. because there's this cardinal rule of like fakely, falsely in writing, falsely creating tension, and just going, but then this thing happened, but then this thing happened, and this chapter does it like crazy. And that whole like Neferata gets killed, like that mountain chimera beats her, kills her effectively. And I think if anybody's ever watched one of Once Bidden's battle reports, we know how effective mountain chimeras are. That isn't no normal chimera. Those things are, you know, beasts of another level. And just whips her silly. But then Krell shows up, and maybe Krell's going to execute her. But then Nagash comes back and heals her completely, right? And just so all of this sort of happening back to back to back. And I just find it... I
thought it was very appropriate given that she was fighting the goblins. The randomness of it seemed very appropriate.
Yeah, I'll definitely grant you the randomness of it, yes, because there wasn't a single goblin around who was like, hey, who's all those undead? Where did they come from? Like, how unaware is every single goblin in this cast? They're not mindless automatons. There wasn't like one wolf rider who was like, hey, where'd those guys come from? You know, just like no one's asking questions in the goblin army.
Well, yeah, this is exactly right, and I think that we have to ask the writers that very question: who was watching to see Krell and his army show up? Because we got to cast ourselves back a long time to find out where that guy last appeared, and that was after Arkan and Kemmler had raided La Maison Tal. It was on the way back to Sylvania that Arkan just left Krell there as a rear guard. And that's the last we heard of him until now. And suddenly he's on the other side of the Empire in the World's Edge Mountains, butting heads against goblins on behest of Nagash or Arkan or who is it that helped him arrive to that point?
Yeah, I think he's there at the behest of the writers who needed a way to artificially save Neferata from the whooping that they handed her at the hands of that chimera. I think that's how he showed up. All I'm saying is, if I'm playing Warhammer and a whole new army marches on from the side of the table, I notice. I'm not like, hey, where'd this extra 1,500 points come from?
Well, the problem is it was a special scenario rule. They let them be ambushers, and the person just had terrible luck rolling, so they didn't show up till turn 6.
Good point.
Except for that player didn't know that they had the models either.
Right. They kept them under the table.
Good. Okay, so well, obviously that all concludes with Grolsnik and his goblins scurrying back into the holes and tunnels that surround Skull Pass, and that opens the passage for Neferata to continue along the way. And that's where we kind of segue again to another forgotten group of folk in the Warhammer world. And at the meantime, roughly over the same passage of the middle months of the year, leading up to I guess this great ritual on Geheimnisnacht, we're going to turn our attention to the dwarfs, the oft forgotten dwarfs. So our old friend Thorek Ironbrow, who is the master of all runesmiths. If we're remembering the prologue, he was one of those that was very, very much outspoken about leaving the dwarf holds to go and fight chaos, because they were, like Neferata as well in the mountains, beset by demons with all this rise of chaos and the turmoil that was in the Winds of Magic. But he spoke against it, and one of the reasons he did is because he had at some point come across a lodestone that he wanted to follow, which he believed would lead him to relics and ultimately lost powers of the dwarf gods, of Grumni and Valia and their other great gods. So what Thorek does, while this timeline is expanding, is he raises an expedition to take him into the hidden underways and very infrequently traveled part of the dwarven highways. And his hope is to follow this lodestone to what he believes would be the ultimate resting place of these dwarf gods. So after a lengthy expedition, he finally finds his way to an otherwise described as a fairly nondescript line of hallway and highway in the underway. And using his lodestone, he pauses there, and they sort of set up shop, as you will. And if you can imagine Thorek and his other runesmiths sort of breaking out their forensic devices, and maybe even the ghost meter to find out what's going on in the neighborhood.
I just picture Thorek wearing like a hat and using a whip and doing some Indiana Jones work on this. Like he's just going to town. Like it's Thorek Ironbrow, Indiana. That's what he's doing there.
Yeah, you're right. I can kind of imagine him rubbing him against the walls, and trying to feel for something, and sniffing the air, and checking for little whiffs of wind coming in underneath the floor or things like that, scattering dust. Yeah, doing all those investigative things that only a Rune Lord could do, of great repute. So anyway, he comes to an interesting discovery. And this interesting discovery is that he senses powerful runes, but yet they are clouded by what he determines to be, and he doesn't know this at first, but upon a bit of research he figures out that they are Nehekaran runes that are also marked on these walls in this passage. He finds that, of course, very curious and very interesting, but also helps convince him that he is in a place of great power and great import. So again, he sets to work and discovers this. And I just want to point out at this stage that back in the early part of Neferata's introduction, when she talks about her former passage through the mountains, she herself discovered a great place of import for the dwarfs, and she marked it with her own runes so that she could find her way back to it in the future. So this is her aim in her whole expedition coming south from Silver Pinnacle. So this all culminates at a very important time. But even before it culminates, I do want to say that Thorek is tuned enough with magic that he feels one big monumental event and feels a big sway in the winds of magic, even though he's deep underground in this underway. And this, of course, is the instance that Nagash is summoned.
It was a million.
He himself feels that.
It was a million beards crying out in terror and suddenly silenced.
Yeah, indeed. So pushing past that feeling that he had drives him on a little bit further to solve these runes so that he can get to the passage beyond. And what he deciphers is that there appears to be one main gate and two side gates for this. And what he manages to do, eventually at one instance, is he solves the runes to open the side gates, both of them. And at the instant that he does that, and the gates swing open, who does he see on the other side? Vincent, you want to take that one?
Absolutely. He sees Krell and all of the undead forces, specifically, like I think and some of the hardest troops are up front. He has like the Banshees and the various things right at the front of the line, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in a wacky cartoon-esque situation, but then the doors were opened and both forces are suddenly staring each other in the face.
So, I want to, while we're talking about the undead forces, I would like to draw your attention, gentlemen, to just one that struck me as logically strange as hell when it talks about the army of Krell, specifically the Hanged Men. And it talks about them being zombies created from corpses hung in Stirlin, and that they went by the judicial gallows trees of the Elector Count there and plucked them like rotting fruit to build this regiment. My question is, how nuts is the Elector Count of Stirlin to be hanging that many people at one time when their bodies are still hanging from the tree in enough numbers to build a quote-unquote regiment?
clearly the law is very severe in Sterling. Like, stole a piece of fruit, hang him. Murdered somebody, hang him. Spoke out of turn about your neighbor, get to the tree, hang him. There's no other cry. Like, it's easy judicial sort of appropriation in.
Well, the problem is with as close as Sterling is to Sylvania, what kind of moron is just leaving corpses hanging in the trees?
Well, here's my theory on how they got there. Sterling's most famous regiment is the Sterling River Patrol, and I assume that they're sort of like the Coast Guard or the park wardens of the Empire world that are nabbing all kinds of people for illicit fishing or too much hunting of game. So I think those are all people that ended up being hanged.
And I've just got the image of like Elmer Fudd hanging from a tree.
Yeah, the park ranger. When he catches like Boo Boo and Yogi, he just hangs them right away. There's no more shenanigans out of that. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey,
And
Boo
thus
Boo,
ends
I'm
that
smarter than the average zombie.
Yeah. I think the key in this is, remember, no one in the Empire actually knows that undead can be created from dead bodies, apparently. That is the take-home point out of this entire end-time story. They all forgot that undead can exist. With that was like the predicating event.
But don't they have, an entire school dedicated to death magic? Don't you think somebody in the Amethyst College would have been able to tell them, guys, just don't leave them hanging there, man. It's just bad.
Who knows? Yeah, you would think like Sterling would have a strict corpse burning policy.
Yeah, but none of those on that death magic college point, none of them do any kind of necromancy though. Like, that's almost sort of a different angle on things. Death magic is just about draining the soul out of you and leaving you dead. It's not about reviving.
Right, but, well, not necessarily. I'll argue they talk about in the fluff how death mages are able to like speak with spirits on the other side. You would think at some point some ghost in the netherworld will tell them, hey guys, those zombies keep coming back because you guys don't burn the bodies or something. I mean, there is some information exchange there that should be being used in this situation, and it's not, and it drives me absolutely insane.
Well, yeah, that's a funny point in the writings. That's for certain. So anyway,
sorry to interrupt.
Back to
no, that's good. Good tangent.
So, of course, what we got to get into now is the dwarfs now find themselves scrambling because they had just been sort of sitting around snacking on granola bars for a couple of weeks while Thorek was rubbing the walls. So now they got to quickly reach for their axes and defend their spot in the underway. Now, granted, despite that, when we get into the battle itself, I want to back up for just a moment, and that is that, and I should have brought this up a moment ago, and that is, once Thorek realizes the gravity of the situation and his discovery, he actually sent envoys to King Cazador to let him know how vitally important his find is about to be, so that hoping that by the time Cazador arrived, that he would be able to fling open the doors and reveal to him this great ancestral point of dwarf history. Now, this is important because we get into the opening salvo of the battle, where the doors swing open and there's Krell, and in pushes a whole legion of undead. The dwarves scramble to stem their flow, and as dwarves do, as we expect them to do, they stand stalwartly and they give no ground, and they're hacking away, chopping up many zombie bodies, including your poor Sterland fruit, and they get chopped aside. But eventually the press of bodies becomes too much. It's a little bit later in the battle, as it goes on, that the other undead force comes in. As we said, there's two doors that open, right? So the other undead force comes down the other channel, and now the dwarves are forced to split and have to handle it on two fronts. This is where it becomes a whole lot more pressing. One thing that we do get that's good in the story here, though, as opposed to what you normally see on a regular Warhammer battlefield, is in that other door. It's the Slayers that really go to town on that second Undead force, and it's fun to see that kind of call come into action as they press back. But either way,
I'm sorry. The other really important thing that's going on here that I just wanted to call out is that I thought was fascinating is before the battles join, it's Krell that effectively makes all of this possible, because Neferata, they make a point before the doors get swung open. They talk about how Neferata just wants to go. She's like, this is silly. Let's just move at full speed. We need to get going. And Krell, always wary of ambush, being the ever brilliant military commander, is making them move in formation and cover corners and be wary of ambushes. Now that he's around, there's no more just charging blindly forward. And so when the doors do flood open, even though he wasn't expecting there to be dwarves on the other side, he was fully prepared and immediately is able to establish beachheads, down in there, so they're not caught in the doorway, because he had moved his powerful troops, his hammers up front, and really served as this brilliant military commander, even though he didn't honestly expect there to be any resistance. And it's only because of that Neferata's force actually is successful in this fight. So even though she would never admit it, she owes everything that happens in this fight and every success to Krell and his military brilliance.
Yeah, agreed. So thank God that guy appeared again.
Captain Plot Point away.
Yeah. So in the ebbs and flows of the battle, being that they're on two fronts, the dwarves do start to lose ground. But here we go with another little bit of and then kind of moment, as you put it, Vince, is King Cazador shows up coming down the underway, because he was sent a missive a little bit earlier from Thorek, and then everything turns in the dwarves' favor again. And they're pushing back the undead and punishing them, and they in fact clear or nearly clear one entire passage of the two. But then almost immediately after that we have another and then moment. And this is our old pal Grulsik back in the action. The ambitious fellow that he is.
Yes, I particularly love his motivation here, as he decides to follow the undead to loot whatever they kill, because he figures dead things don't take loot. And I find that to be a particularly brilliant insight. Like, that is just this guy is a goblin amongst goblins. He really is fantastic. And so, yeah, he bursts in right behind. And so now we have this giant clash of effectively 4 different armies, all just making a flat mess of everything. And the other thing to point out is that separated from the main dwarf army was Thorek, and he's on the Anvil of Doom. And so he had kind of gotten parted from his force, and the Immentet, we're going to call her Neferata's girlfriend. So Neferata's girlfriend. Yes, Nicole Richie on her Coven throne is basically engaging in this massive spell battle with the Anvil of Doom, where they're like throwing magic back and forth at each other and not failing, and he's lashing out with lightning, and they're throwing back necromantic energy and raising undead, and back and forth and back and forth. And I will just say that if the Anvil of Doom was actually, let's say, 10% as effective on the actual table as it was in the descriptive text of this battle, it would be in every dwarf's list ever in every game of Warhammer. It is really a shame that it does not in any way live up to the narrative power that Thorek is able to coax from it here, as he just calls forth lightning after lightning bolt to smote the enemies of the dwarves in a really just amazing fashion. I don't like dwarves that much, but it's such a good passage of, they talk about how he rings the hammer, or he rings his hammer on the anvil time and again and again and again until the anvil is white hot with the heat of the magic and the runic power he's forcing through it. I mean, the whole cave is resounding. It's just a fantastic passage that feels really dwarven and great.
And I think if we're talking about that, we definitely have to focus on sort of, if we're going to bring in the unrealistic power of this anvil, is what it does to the Coven Throne and Nicole Richie. I mean, he cracks a bolt of lightning at her, blows up the Coven throne, and reduces her to less than ash. It says that her body was so scorched that not even dust was left to fall. And I'm like, that is freaking amazing. I wish something like that could happen on the tabletop.
Yeah. And in doing so, he does have a moment of pause, doesn't he? Thorek there's cracks. Not only is it getting white hot, like you described, Vincent, but it's beginning to crack under the repeated punishment that anvil is taking and the power that he's drawing from it. But before we get to the culmination of that, and we're going to come back to that here in a second, I just want to come in again to a little bit of the ebb and flow of battle. So Cazador is there, and then the goblins show up, and the goblin randomness as it is, so it's squigs hopping and it's things biting and fanatics thrashing around all over the place that is equally shredding skeletons and dwarves alike. It proves to be the demise of the brave fight of the Slayers. They get their glorious end, or maybe an inglorious end, depending on how you look at it from a dwarf perspective, getting their brains smashed in by swinging fanatical goblins. But still at that point, it's the dwarfs that do appear to have lost the upper hand, even with Cazador's intervention. But it sort of becomes a split of two different battles. As we said, the one flank has crumbled, and it's the undead taking that stock, and Imhotep and eventually Neferata come and close in on Thorek, where he's sort of laid camp down. And at the other end, it is now predominantly goblins that are holding off the relief force of the dwarfs from the other flank. But then let's get down to the final culmination of it. In on him, and again disdainfully rolling her eyes that she has to yet again get involved and do the final bit of work. But Thorek kind of looks up to the sky, or the roof in this case, and he comes down knowing that this final hammer blow is going to ruin his mighty anvil of doom, and he does it anyway. And he comes down, and a huge horde explosion ensues, thus ending himself and pretty much everything else around him. And that's sort of set for math. So perhaps the aftermath of this as it pertains to how we opened up with Neferata.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing that I just wanted to call out that happens here is I really like that everything that happens with Thorek is fantastic, and the cracking of the anvil and everything. But also you have the culmination in the other tunnel, as there was a ghoul king on a terror geist that swoops forth, and the King Cazador, who shows up, just basically just crushes that terror geist in the span of one blow. Clearly, he had the master rune of D6 wounds or whatever, because he just ends that thing instantaneously. And the Strigoi Ghoul King tries to get up, and it talks about how the Strigoi Ghoul King is ready to go. All right, he stands up and his claws are out, and he's going to go, beat down by dwarfs. He just immediately gets beat down by dwarfs. Like, he doesn't even swing a blow. They're just on him, pounding him down on the ground, and he gets ended. And
I do have to say regarding all this and sort of the next sections, there may be a lot of hatred for the dwarves out there, but there is no army in the Warhammer world that can lose a battle with as much style as the bearded folk.
Well, that's good. That's what they spend most of their time doing.
Yeah. Right. But I mean, just every bit. I mean, you go through. It's something like 5 paragraphs here of them just being totally badass and still losing.
Yep. And so then, obviously, that then has our culmination between King Cazador and Krell. And basically, they both step forward, and in our classic sort of challenge, they both fight each other. And both of their blows fall simultaneously. And though King Cazador's blow is strong and true and does greatly injure Krell, it is not as true as Krell's axe, which lops off King Cazador's head and sends it down to the ground. And then, boom, the Anvil of Doom is split, and big giant explosion, everything is rocked. Battle basically over as everything explodes.
Yeah, I'm glad you came back to that because I admit that I had missed that in my reread of it or failed to remember that Cazador had come to an end even before the giant explosion.
Yeah, he definitely took out his
however,
points. He made his points back before he went out, so that was good.
yeah. So after that big explosion, it sort of comes to an end here, and they do have a little bit of a dust settles kind of moment as a sidebar tail end of this, and despite all that havoc that has been wreaked there, and that it effectively just the whole. Neferata does pull herself out of the dust, and she pushes aside some rubble and rises, so she's got the constitution. as many of these, and then she looks across the dark hall and sees Krell pull himself out of the dust as well. And a little bit. And realized that with the flow of magic out of the anvil, as well as everything else that has happened, it's broken the sea as well. So Neferata does in fact reach her final goal of what she was after, right? But she doesn't actually go in of it revealing what that inner sanctum really does reveal after all that build-up, does it? Or did I miss that in there?
It mentions in the previous thing that as Thorek was getting close, he heard Volya speak to him, not like in his mind, but just sort of he sensed it in his dwarfiness that he knew that like his sense was that Volya herself was here.
His beard sense was tingling.
Yes, exactly. But I don't think I don't think it really becomes clear to Neferata at that point.
Yeah. So then, gents, what out of this chapter in particular do you sort of key in on as a big moment for the storyline here and Warhammer as a whole? Do you want to speak to that, Josh?
Yeah, I'll go in. I definitely, the two areas of this that really stuck out to me, and again, this may be from my own personal distaste for the Tomb Kings. I kind of find Neferata just boring as a character. Like I said, I think she's just a carbon copy of what we had out of the Von Karsteins up to this point. I actually loved the two other races that we had here. The goblins, Grulsik was just a perfect night goblin commander, and really went to show how even the other sort of less powerful races are going to be taking advantage of this darkness that Nagash is bringing with him. And so I think it's very nice to see that opportunistic side of the goblins, and they're not really just being played for as a joke here. And then number two was the presence of the dwarves. Like I said earlier, nobody can lose a battle with as much style as the dwarves, but I think you can look at it as kind of a bigger understanding of how the good races are going to be handling this. I mean, evil, the forces of destruction in Nagash are winning, but you're seeing that the forces of order are not giving up without a fight. They're not going quietly. They're going to stand to face it. Even if it very likely means all of their deaths, they're going to go out like warriors. And I thought just the different ways it showed the different dwarf forces facing their doom with honor was just awesome, and that spoke to me more than anything.
So do I get a sense then that you have gained a little inkling of more respect for the dwarves?
Oh, don't get me wrong. I love the dwarves as a race. I mean, I used to play them myself. The only reason I gave them up and traded them is that their mechanics are kind of terrible, and I didn't enjoy that. But I mean, as far as their history and the fluff behind them, I love the dwarves. And I think this has them written. I mean, if you're going to write the dwarves as a doomed race, this is the way to write them as a doomed race, is that they're not going to be whiny like some of the others are, and, oh, no, let's just hide in our caverns, let's let the evil flow on by. It's like, no, let's go out and kick some ass, even if it costs us everything. And I think that's just was perfectly done in this chapter.
Okay. And how about you, Vince? What were some key points for you in this part of the tale?
Well, I think the only thing that bothers me about this chapter is it really does feel kind of like filler, as it's happening already in a time we've already covered. To me, this chapter is like, so if we all know Episode 4 of Star Wars and when Luke blows up the Death Star, I feel like this is the story of like Soldier Number 5 on the planet of Yavin 4 and what he was doing on his patrol duty right before the Death Star blows up. Like, yeah, that's interesting. Neat that other people in the world existed, but there's a more important story going on, and you told that in the last chapter. You know, that one really progressed the story. I feel like this is mainly just some fun battles and some characters die and, you know, whatever. It's not really, it doesn't advance the overall narrative of the book. That being said, but go ahead.
No, I'll have to agree with you on that one, or disagree with you on that one, actually, Vince. Both in terms of what's going on here and your analogy. Interestingly enough, there is actually a novel written called Death Star that follows basically people who were on the Death Star leading up to its original destruction and a little bit afterwards. And it's not so much that stories like that or like this one are really furthering the overall narrative. What I think they're doing is they're fleshing out a larger sense of the world around these mega events. If you just tell the mega events, it can kind of break you out of that sense of suspension of disbelief, because it's just like, ooh, big powerful gods working. You don't really see how it's affecting others. And that's actually what I really liked about this, is you got to see how these big mega events are affecting other people in the world. And I think this chapter, that's the purpose for this chapter being set up the way it is.
Yeah, I think you're right, that's what it's doing, but in the end, I guess I'm just not keen. Perhaps it's my personal tastes, but the story just doesn't appeal to me. It does feel like so much hanging wallpaper on the Titanic, right? Like, the boat's still going to sink. I don't care. Also, I'm interested into the characters we follow after the Death Star blows up. Does that mean we follow their space dust as they like float around the universe and become, you know, like, or whatever? But I'm sure people escape. But anyways, so what I do love about this chapter is, what I'll say is, I have no love for the dwarves. I despise them to their core. Everything about those stupid little bearded stunties bothers me in every part of me. But that being said, they do fight well in here, and the battles are written really well. As worthless as I find this chapter to be to the overall narrative, it is a fun chapter to read, because the battles are cool, they're well written, and the goblins are just, anytime you introduce goblins, you're in for a good time, because that's a race who knows how to party. And they really, and they deliver here. Like, they're fun, they show up at all the wrong times, they do all the right things to cause all the chaos you want. And it's fun to read and fun to watch their crazy things bounce around and ruin everybody else's good plans. So I very much enjoyed them, and I did enjoy a lot of the dwarven fight. It felt like a good battle. So it's still an enjoyable read despite being not good to the narrative. That's what I'll say.
And I feel that I agree with you that my favorite point about this was the goblin interventions and failures and moments of where they believed they were going to be successful and those kinds of things. And I think it was very reflective of how I have always felt that goblins and their goblin armies react in the Warhammer world. So I was quite pleased with how that was put forth in the narrative of this. It was very good. I think to speak to your other point, though, to get really anything of great value out of this chapter, you have to believe in Neferata. You have to believe in that character, and you have to sort of buy in that she's a big player in this narrative. And if you're just reading this sequentially along, I think it leaves you with that thought that she is going to become a big player in the end of it, with her designs on her spy network that it starts out with, and her designs to prove her favor to Nagash, and eventually she does, at the end of this chapter, get the prize that she was after to prove that, and that's where it sort of leaves it. With so whether you believe in her as in the grander scheme or not, I think that's where you get the value out of the chapter, if you believe that she is going to be something big. Agreed?
Yes, and as I previously mentioned, I hate her only slightly less than I hate dwarves. So that's why that might be another reason why this chapter is a big whiff for me. It's just full of all the things I don't like packed into one story. Only the goblins save it. Thank you, mighty goblins, for being wonderful all the time.
See, I can buy that as the aim or the sort of the requirement for this, but I think the big problem is because they wrote it so much as a kind of and then sort of storyline, it's hard to take Neferata seriously. Yeah, she wins by the end of it. Am I the only one who feels like she didn't earn it? It just,
Oh,
I mean,
no, I'm with you. I think
kind of
she does win at the end of it, despite herself, despite all of her failings and tactical ineptitude. Yeah, I agree with you. It's despite herself, she ends up still standing at the end. Fully agree.
And
Anyway.
I think that's a weakness of this particular section, because you just don't know who to pull for. I mean, Krell is the closest thing to an actual competent character we're seeing in this line that survives to the end. So,
right. Well, gents, coming to a close of chapter 3, then I suppose we're making our way through this mighty tale of the end times. Do you have any other final thoughts before we bid farewell to our viewers? Good.
Look forward to chapter 4 and all the fun that's going to ensue.
Yes, we are going to get back into it again and cast our eyes back upon the men of the Empire for the next chapter. So until then, people, I raise a mug. Thank you for your time. And thanks to all of our viewers. And we'll see you again for more of The End Times.